Hello, this is Storybooks channel. New videos are posted every day. Subscribe and click the bell.
It's hard for a disabled person to find a job. Charles knew this as well as anyone. He was already 25 years old, and during this time the guy managed to work as a janitor, a floor bridge in a store. And that was the end of his career. He was kicked out of all the places because he wasn't mine. It so happened that during pregnancy his mom had a lot of nervousness, and it affected the health of the baby. The guy could not boast of a happy childhood and youth at all. He grew up in a village where there were no conditions for people with such problems. He did not go to a kindergarten, so he grew up a very modest and shy boy. Apart from his mom, he had no friends. At school, he studied a few grades and was transferred to homeschooling. Teachers could not find an approach to the student and often just skipped classes with him. That's why his mother took the responsibility for his education on herself. She did it quite well. Charles could write, count, and read very well. He was smarter than many of his peers. But who cared? He couldn't speak, so everyone still considered him beneath them. On the street, he was not accepted in the company. Even some parents forbade their children to be friends with him. If it wasn't for his mom, Charles would have never accepted the world. He lived with his stepfather. Their relationship was in no way bad. Not a good man spent little time with the child, though he loved him like a family member. He just didn't know how to interact with the boy. In addition, the man passed away early. Charles was left alone with his mother. Had it not been for her son, the unhappy woman would have probably killed herself. She was miserable. Charles' father left her without even saying goodbye properly, and her second husband had died. She found her fulfillment in being and a child. They lived poorly, but they had enough for the necessities. Mom didn't count on more than that. The boy did not like to remember his childhood, because he did not have any bright and cheerful moments in life. Sometimes he wished he'd missed graduation. First love, fights, everything that every man experienced. All he had was his mother, home, textbooks, and pencil sketchbooks. Drawing is where he found himself. He put all his fantasies, all his dreams, all his resentments on a piece of paper. It was his outlet. I must say he was very good at drawing. He could have made a career as an artist if he had any confidence in himself and his talent. Of course, his mother supported him. But what could she do for him? There wasn't even an art school in the remote village. Charles once again looked at the job advertisements. They said they were hiring people with disabilities. But in fact, they were politely turned down everywhere. The guy needed a job. His mom had recently died. Almost all his savings went to organize the farewell ceremony, and it was impossible to live on one pension. Charles never knew his father. He had a stepfather, but he had crashed his motorcycle a long time ago. So he did not despair and continued his search, except for himself. He had no one to rely on. Once he came across an advertisement of a company. The firm was engaged in the manufacture of jewelry. It was a fashionable and modern production. In their advertising, the manufacturers indicated that they were expanding, delivering products all over the country. But Charles was attracted to something else. One of their features of the firm indicated that they work with any category of citizens. They hire people with disabilities. He decided to see if there was a place for him in the company. Charles wrote an email to the firm's email account. He was invited for an interview. The guy spent the whole night imagining himself in his new workplace. It is not cleaning streets and premises, but a whole jewelry company. Maybe he would work with precious metals. Charles imagined creating jewelry or selling it. It was something he couldn't even dream of. Always thought his best was picking up trash after someone's party. The guy couldn't sleep. He sat down at his computer and started drawing. Charles was a withdrawn kid. Nobody wanted to hang out with him because he wasn't. Hiding from the taunts of mean kids. Little Charles started drawing. That hobby carried over into adulthood. He was very good at it. As he got older, he saved up money from gifts and bought himself a cheap tablet. And then his mom gave the boy a laptop. Charles began to create unique drawings. Already on the gadgets, he worked with different editors and programs. He dreamed of becoming a designer, but did not dare to send his works to firms and offer his services. That night, he decided it was time to stop hoarding his talent. He decided to bring a few designs to the interview in the rings he had started creating in the beginning. Finishing his work, Charles glanced at his watch. He had a little over 2 o'clock to sleep. Charles went to bed, but the excitement of the morning interview did not let him go. He didn't even realize he had fallen asleep. It seemed as if he had just closed his eyes. How did the alarm clock go off? He dreamed of his new job. He was looking around the office, which he was given, arranging his brushes, paints, studying a fashionable and expensive computer, which had a lot of programs for creating masterpieces. How Charles did not want this dream to end. He almost slept through his alarm clock. So much he wanted to linger in the world of dreams and fantasies. But it was time to get up and walk towards his dream. He drank coffee on the way and grabbed a flash drive with his artwork, and then decided to print it out just in case. On his way to the company, he imagined how he would be praised, offered a good position right away. He looked at the company's website and imagined himself as a part of this friendly team. Unfortunately, everything did not go as smoothly as in his fantasies. The guy was quickly brought back to reality. Charles was greeted by a friendly young woman. He said hello to her with a gesture, but she looked at the guys with misunderstanding. Charles was surprised by this, because the company positions itself to be welcoming to people with different problems. So the employees should be prepared and trained. But he didn't take this moment to heart. After all, it's just a girl at the front desk. What happened next was nothing but sadness. James said the front desk girl knocked on the supervisor's door. That's where the guy you were talking about yesterday came in. There were several people in the supervisor's office. James himself, Mason, his assistant, and Jacob. He was a business partner and the second man in the company. And this one is not mine, James clarified. Let him come in, we're waiting for him, Jacob replied. The girl pointed to the door, suggesting that Charles should come in. He heard his own name being called. When the boy entered the office, he was examined from all sides. Mason was rubbing his hands together as if in anticipation of something good. James looked at Charles with disbelief. He doesn't look like an invalid at all. They won't believe us, he said. You think all invalids have their problems written on their foreheads? Jacob laughed. Good one. He and I are going to win the contest. What jobs do you have that even a deaf-mute could do? Charles tried to gesture that he could hear everything. He guessed that he had not been hired to help at all, but just for the sake of a contest. No one paid attention to Charles' movement. Then he took out his notebook, which he always carried for such occasions, and wrote there that he could not only speak, he could hear perfectly well. The men were discussing something heatedly when Charles threw his note on the table in front of them. They were instantly quiet and embarrassed. I wish they'd cut your tongue, Jacob, James said unhappily. Charles hadn't been paying attention to their conversation, so he guessed that while he was making his notes, it sounded like something he shouldn't have heard. It's upsetting. The kid even more so. He figured he was about to be chased away. How was he afraid of that? A storm of emotions boiled inside him. Just a few hours ago, he had envisioned himself in his new workplace, and now he saw that sympathetic look again. Those eyes that hid from him, that embarrassment as the man picked up the words for a polite rejection. We'll hire you as a courier to deliver purchases to customers and deliver documents around the office, Jacob said, ignoring his colleague's remark. All Charles' hopes were shattered at that moment. It was not how he had envisioned his job with the company, but he was appointed to a small position again. He decided to try his luck and took out his drawings. While the men were looking at the pictures and didn't understand why he was showing them to them, Charles quickly wrote that he would like to try his hand at design. Very good models, said Mason, who had been silent until then. Yes, you're good. But we don't need designers yet. And if anything, we will keep in mind that we have such talents, replied James. Maria, the girl who met you, will tell you about the nuances of your work, and I will warn her that you can hear perfectly well. Poor thing, she thought she'd have to learn sign language by now. There was loud laughter from the three men in the office. Charles doesn't share their joy at all. He was rejected again, given the lowest position. But at least he wasn't a janitor. Of course, he realized that no one in this company would ever give him a chance to show his talent. Charles left the office to the ringing laughter of the bosses. and Masha quickly ran into the office. After a few minutes, she came out and explained all the intricacies of Charles' job. That day, he was led home to work. He was supposed to be out tomorrow. Masha exhaled as the guy left the reception area. She didn't know how to talk to people like that. It was unclear to the girl why they needed an employee who wasn't mine if the staff was already overcrowded. She wanted to eavesdrop on the conversation in the boss's office, but got a door on her forehead. "Masha, you're doing a very bad thing." Jacob threatened her, but he did it with a good-natured joke. As soon as Charles left the office, there immediately began a heated discussion. Jacob was extremely unhappy that they had found a candidate so quickly. James was worried about the company's reputation. Mason was agreeing with one or the other. "I think the customers will not be happy with such a courier," James said. "Come on, we need to keep him on for a month. We'll give him a couple of orders, so the customers will see that we really have such an employee. The rest of the time we'll be in the office to deliver papers." Jacob calmed the companions. "And how are you going to fire him then? We can't just fire a disabled person. And if he makes a scandal?" The other James also objected. "We'll figure out a way to make him want to leave or something. With our minds, we won't be lost." Jacob continued to think positively. It turns out that James's company participated in some kind of contest. If they won, they would receive a huge amount of investment. One of the conditions of the contest was to have employees from different social groups. Parents with many children, disabled people, and other socially vulnerable people. That's why they needed Charles. No one wanted to help him. James was driven only by a lust for profit. Winning. Charles walked home, absorbed in his own thoughts. He wanted something more than a small position. He knew he was capable of accomplishing much, but his illness cut off just about every opportunity. The boy was angry with himself, and then decided that he needed to start with small victories. He really liked to read about the success stories of different businessmen. They all started from scratch. Most of them also worked as assistants or laborers. Charles put himself in a positive frame of mind. Let him work as a courier for a while. Then new opportunities will open up for him. He will show himself at his best. With this attitude, he went to work the next day. Charles took a long time to decide how to dress. He tried on all his suits, which he had bought for some reason, and never used them once in his life. But he wanted to make a good impression on his bosses, to show that he was worthy of more than just delivering papers. Mason and Jacob greeted Charles kindly. They smiled at him, shook his hand. Only James was too pensive. He was worried that he'd lose his regular customers because of this delivery guy. He didn't want to get to know the guy. He wasn't interested in his ideas. This man always thought he was superior to others. He thought he was the smartest, the most successful. He didn't care about the others. In his first order, Charles found himself with a strange customer. Her eyes were red, as if she had just cried. Why would such a beautiful woman cry? The courier thought. She has a very nice apartment. She herself is attractive. He was delivering an expensive ring to her. The woman asked if Charles liked being a courier. He nodded. She asked another question, but Charles could not answer it. "Why are you all ignoring me?" Suddenly, a customer shouted, "Are you unwashed?" Charles nodded in response. Then the woman apologized. She got that Charles' hating look of sympathy. He didn't like to be pitied. After all, he was just as human as everyone else, just creating less of a fuss around him. He walked out of the entryway and slammed the door loudly. How long could he put up with this humiliation? Why? As soon as people find out about his problem, they immediately start considering themselves superior to him. This customer even gave him an obscenely large tip, which did not bring the guy any joy at all. They felt like beggars, he thought. Charles found the gesture very insulting. The first orders went well. But in the second week of work, trouble struck Charles. He was on his way up to the right floor. Some guy snatched the package from him. Charles immediately rushed after him. In the box was a necklace worth several couriers' paychecks. He ran after him for several blocks. At one point, Charles even wondered how he had so much strength. The intruder turned often, and each time noticed that the chase was continuing. It seemed that the thief was exhausted too. He wondered why the courier had not even shouted anything to him. Charles cursed himself for not even being able to call for help. It is not known how long the chase would have lasted if not for the bus driver who stopped the thief. Unfortunately, for good. The criminal once again turned around to see if he had gotten away or not, and didn't notice as he ran out into the road. As luck would have it, the bus driver was looking in the wrong direction at that moment. At the previous stop, a pretty girl entered the cabin, which collected all the looks of the passengers and the driver. For a long time afterwards, he scolded himself for this carelessness. The thief flew far from the road and hit his head on the asphalt. The ambulance only had to state death. The box flew far away from the scene. But Charles found it. He didn't wait for the intruder to be unleashed. No one noticed the courier who picked up the stolen goods. Charles delivered the necklace to the address. Very late, much to his surprise. The door was opened by a man who looked like he could not at all say he could afford such a piece of jewelry. He was wearing a dirty t-shirt and stretched sports pants. He opened the door. The man was very surprised that the package had been delivered to him at all. Then Charles guessed that the whole thing was a setup. No one was going to redeem the jewelry. It was originally planned to be stolen. The courier told James about the situation. He praised the guy, said that it was absolutely necessary to report to the police about what had happened. Did the man do it or not? Charles did not find out. He did not care. The main thing was that he was able to return the jewelry to his boss. If it had been stolen, he would have had to work for free for several months. By the way, Charles is not lying. Jacob said the next day, "I saw a report yesterday about a guy who got hit by a bus." Do you realize how far that is from the address where he had a delivery? James wondered. He could run marathons. The men laughed. Charles was excellent at his job, even with such difficult cases. It was frustrating to James. He knew he couldn't keep the guy on the job for long. The man was beginning to grow attached to him. Something drew him to this guy. It seemed to him that his eyes were like someone else's, as if he had seen that kind and naive look somewhere before. He could only remember one other person with the same good-natured look, but James pushed those thoughts and memories away from him. That person was forever erased from his life. Perhaps that was why he was so eager to get rid of this messenger sooner rather than later, lest he get out. His memories didn't make up for the longing. Charles had already been working for the company for 3 weeks. He was doing an excellent job. The customers were happy with him. Even in the office, Charles had friends who were happy to help him find the right address. They helped him with paperwork and other things. Jacob was surprised to see that the boy was doing well. He offered to keep him, but James was absolutely against it. The firm still won the competition, so the boss wanted to get rid of the courier as soon as possible. James, think about it. He's doing a great job. Jacob persuaded him. Why fire him? You know he didn't even have the position. Why would I pay extra wages? Said James. If I have to choose which courier to keep, I'm not going to choose the handicapped one. The customers love him. Charles Mason stood up for Charles Mason. He doesn't even have a negative review. Not a single rejection. James threw the assistant a disgruntled look. He hated to be talked down to. Mason realized that it was better to remain silent. He was used to his opinion being given little weight around here. In some ways, he felt just as handicapped. He worked almost more than anyone else, but never received praise from his superiors. His efforts were invisible. But send him out of the company and the whole thing would fall apart. Okay, but he won't want to leave. Have you thought of a way to avoid further problems? Asked Jacob. The man was silent. He hoped that his friend would come up with an idea. Jacob was in charge of creativity. Suddenly, Mason extended his hand like a schoolboy who knows the right answer. He attended almost all the meetings of the bosses, but usually only wrote down ideas. He never suggested his own. But then he had an idea. "I know how we're going to do this smugly," Mason declared. Both men turned to him and stared intently at the assistant. They had already forgotten that he was in the office. "Mason, even you huffed and puffed up with courage at such an unexpected flood of attention toward him." "We'll set him up," Mason continued to tell his plan. Mason shared the proposal. Jacob patted his assistant on the shoulder and praised him for a great idea. James also liked the plan Mason came up with. The very next day, they decided to implement it. "You're a scary man, Mason. We should watch out for you," Jacob joked. Charles came to work in a great mood. He liked the feeling of being a part of such a big company. He had been working here for almost a month now, and he wanted to go to the boss soon and offer his design ideas again. He could see that Jacob was treating him well, so he thought he could do it. While Charles was walking around the office and waiting for his assignments for the day, Mason approached him. He decided to ask if Charles was happy with everything. Maybe someone was giving him a hard time. Charles cocked his head to indicate that no one was picking on him. "If there are any problems, be sure to let me know," Mason said, and put his arm around Charles. The courier had not expected such a gesture, but he responded with a friendly smile. Once again, Charles made sure that he was in the right place and was welcome here. After lunch, James called Charles to his office. The boy went in the same good mood. "Maybe I should bring it up with my designers again today. Everyone is so complacent," Charles thought to me as I approached the supervisor's door. But when he entered the office, all his joy quickly evaporated. James was very angry. His eyebrows were chicken hands. He folded on his chest, which he did only if he was going to swear. "It has come to my attention that you stole one of our wares," James said. Charles shook his head fearfully and waved his hands. He couldn't even think of taking someone else's. "There's no need to argue. We have video footage that clearly shows you taking our jewelry." Jacob was lying out of his ass. "Mason, check his backpack." Mason took the backpack from Charles' hands, and he handed it over without question because he knew he was innocent. Mason had already guessed on the first try where the stolen ring was. Charles opened his eyes in surprise and shook his head again. That was why Mason had approached him. He had planted the jewelry. Charles guessed, "You write your resignation or we'll fire you, and you'll never be able to get a job as a janitor again." In a harsh tone, James said. Charles asked to see the camera footage that showed him stealing the ring, to which Jacob replied that they still had the footage, but if he resisted, she would go to the police. Then the courier would have bigger problems than getting fired. At this point, Charles guessed that they just wanted him out. If even Jacob libretto the footage from the cameras, then the three of them are in cahoots. Charles didn't see the point in going up against them. He knew they wouldn't give him a quiet life, and a dishonorable discharge would close off all future job opportunities. He didn't have many. Charles wrote a letter of resignation. That's all. "And you were worried," cheering up Jacob. "How'd he give up so fast? Too bad for the kid, but we have to think about the image of the company," said James indifferently. After work, James came home. It was the only place where he could be himself. At work, he had to make himself a strict boss at meetings to show status and friendliness to the partners, whom he could not stand. And only at home he took off all the masks and stayed alone with himself. He was 45, and he had no one close to him except his favorite cat. Only she saw how this man suffered, how he was tormented by loneliness. Why should he have all this wealth if he had no one to share it with? James looked at himself and did not understand when he had managed to turn into such a beast. After all, he used to be an ordinary guy who just wanted to achieve something in life. All his life, he wanted to get rid of the oppression of his parents. They were rich people and demanded achievements from their son. He was constantly reminded that he couldn't do half-assed. He had to give his best. It was because of them that he became so angry at everyone around him. He was taught from childhood that their family was superior to everyone else. He's only ever loved one girl in his entire life. That was over 20 years ago. Then James was still very young and did not believe in happiness and love for life. But the girl betrayed him. She said goodbye to him and a letter confessed that she had fallen in love with another. Did not have the courage to even confess in his eyes. After that, James stopped believing women. He had no serious relationships for all these years. Although there were many girls around the successful and handsome man, he did not let any of them get close to him. To distract himself from his sad thoughts, James decided to work. He always solved work issues if sadness came over him. The man pulled out his work folder and a few sheets of paper came out of it. James looked at the images carefully. They were the designs Charles had brought in. He had forgotten about them. The kid was really talented. If it weren't for his dumbness, James thought. He sent the pictures of the jewelry to Jacob and signed, designing a new collection. Colleagues liked the images and he supported the idea. Jacob did not remember where the designs came from. Charles went home, barely holding back tears. He didn't understand why the world was so cruel to him. Once again, he was being thrown out of his job just because of his illness. Is there no place in this world for people like him? Why does he have to spend his life sweeping streets or washing dishes? He's even been kicked out of his job as a delivery boy. For the first time in his life, Charles wanted to drink himself into oblivion. He never drank alcohol at all. Charles got home in the morning. He drank very little, but it was enough for him. He barely made it to bed and fell asleep. He slept most of the next day. Good thing I don't have to go to work, Charles ironized to himself. It had been 2 weeks since Charles had been out of work. All this time he had been watching movies, trying to distract himself from his sad thoughts. He didn't think about finding a new job, and he didn't want to, because he knew that he would end up with the usual rejection or the lowest position. Suddenly, the screen of his cell phone lit up. A strange girl had written to Charles. She was praising his work. The guy was posting his drawings on his page. She said that they were written with a soul, but the subjects of the images were very sad. The author must have been very sad about something. Charles didn't know what to say. He had never met a girl before, neither online nor in real life. He was embarrassed about his disability, thought people like him were doomed to be alone forever. To a huge message of praise, Charles replied with a humble thank you. The girl did not relent. They met. Adriana was the name of the stranger, and she told him that she was an art historian. Accordingly, she knows paintings well. So she could tell that Charles' pictures were not without talent. Adriana proposed a meeting. Charles refused. He was pleased with the woman's attention. He wanted to remember this moment, but not to mar it by meeting. He was sure that as soon as Adriana found out that Charles was not mine, she would immediately stop communicating with him. Charles looked at the next message from Adriana and fought the urge to reply. He hated himself and his illness for his inability to even think about a normal life. Charles loved to take walks in the park. He looked at happy couples and realized that he could never experience such a feeling himself. He avoided any communication with girls. Finally, he decided to block Adriana so he wouldn't suddenly snap and text her. An hour later, he blocked her back. The girl had stopped texting. I guess she decided that Charles was some kind of weirdo who blocked her several times during the evening, and then blocked her the next day. So be it. The guy thought he'd get off my back. Boredom. Charles started scrolling through his social media feed, and he saw an advertisement from the firm where he had been so brazenly framed so recently. The guy even wiped his eyes because he thought he had imagined it. But no, the picture showed a ring. He had designed it. The company was introducing a new and unique collection. Charles looked at all the pictures and most of the jewelry was designed by him. The guy immediately wanted to leave an angry comment to fly the cheaters away. But it was deleted after a few minutes. Subsequent attempts were also unsuccessful. Charles frantically pressed the buttons of the phone, shaking it in his hands. He had probably never felt such anger before. He was shaking from the inside out. What a bunch of assholes, Charles thought. Not only did they cheat, but they stole my ideas. Charles quickly packed up and headed for James's office. He was ready to smash everything in his path. He was so angry, but the security guard wouldn't even let him near the entrance. Saddened by his failure, he went home. Charles cried for a long time and could not understand why this world was so cruel to him, how he deserved such an attitude. He wanted to share this sadness with someone, but he had no one near and dear to him. He wanted to go to his little homeland. Charles packed his bags and went to the village. He wanted to go to his mother's grave and spend some time in his parents' house. James reported that the former courier came, tried to get to the chief, and was very angry. The man was not surprised at all. He had warned security in advance not to let this man on the doorstep. Probably found out about our new collection, Jacob suggested. It doesn't make sense anymore, James waved his hand. He'd never come in here again. and he'll never prove to anyone that he came up with the design. We have the name and the credibility. What does he have? For lunch, James went to his favorite restaurant. He was in a good mood due to the release of a new jewelry collection. The man wanted to celebrate the occasion with a juicy old man and a glass of good wine. He had such a tradition of indulging himself with a delicious meal after a profitable affair. There was no other joy in his life. James ordered and looked out the window across the restaurant, hanging a poster of his jewelry. He looked at it with a clear sense of pride. The man felt no pangs of conscience. The guy's talented after all. A thought ran through James's mind. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he felt remorse for deceiving the invalid. But he could easily push them away from him. To take his mind off the sad thoughts a little rolled over him. The man looked into the hall of a posh restaurant. Here a woman caught his eye. It seemed to him that somewhere he had seen her before. He frantically began to search his memories for acquaintances. He had seen 1,000 faces at social evenings, presentations, and events, but for some reason this particular face he could not reconstruct in his memory. But then it hit him. It was Betty. Betty was the best friend of Kathy, the woman James had loved all his life. She was the one who had closed the door to others in his heart forever. She had abandoned him as a young man so cruelly and indifferently. James felt an unbearable heaviness in his chest. He wanted to go to Betty to ask about his former lover and find out why she had broken his heart so coldly. He fought the urge. It wasn't appropriate for a man as solid as he was to pick at his own youthful grievances. James couldn't stop looking at the woman. Images from the past flashed through his mind. Back then, he had been happy and uncaring. At that time, there was no need to lie and pretend to be an angry and serious man. There were plans for future dreams and hopes. Yes, he had achieved everything he had dreamed of in his youth. But was he happy? Unfortunately, James could unequivocally answer that question. He knew better than anyone that happiness wasn't about money. It's not in connections or opportunities. It's in the people he never had. When he was a boy, he didn't have a huge fortune. Yes, his parents were rich, but it wasn't all his. Now he had everything but the main thing, except love and a family hearth. But then Betty looked up, apparently sensing that someone was literally drilling her with a stare. James quickly looked away. He hoped she hadn't recognized him. But the woman put the menu aside and stared intently. Then she suddenly stood up and walked straight toward James. He tried not to show his excitement. "Well, hello." Betty said hello with some aggression in her voice. "You were right to be defensive," James replied casually, but his voice trembled at the end of the sentence. Betty smiled wryly and sat down at his table. She was trying to catch James's eye, looking at him sideways and smiling oddly. There was a judgment in her eyes that the man didn't understand. He was the victim. His feelings trampled and his life broken. Why was she looking at him so strangely? She came to gloat. To James' good fortune, a waiter approached and handed Betty a menu. She had to shift her piercing gaze to him. The woman placed her order and continued to glare at James. He literally didn't know where to get away from the scrutiny. "How can you live with yourself knowing you're the ultimate scumbag?" Betty asked, after I placed the order. James was very surprised at that question. He figured she had somehow found out about his scam with the handicapped courier. "What do you care about that guy?" James answered the question with a question. Betty looked at him with complete bewilderment. The woman obviously meant something else. She thought for a moment and decided to ignore the inappropriate question. "I don't know which guy you're talking about," Betty continued after an awkward pause. "I'm talking about what you did to Kathy. It wasn't nice to leave her pregnant." James' eyes rounded and his face stretched into a surprised grimace. He didn't even know Kathy was pregnant. Why on earth would Betty claim that James had abandoned her? The man is completely confused by now. First, she looks at him as an enemy of the people, and now she's giving him some obscure facts. "Are you really delusional?" asked the astonished James. "Kathy left me at such a difficult moment. I was in a coma, and she found herself a new boyfriend. Decided I'd never recover. She had an affair, and then she didn't even have the conscience to tell me to my face about her betrayal. She wrote me some lousy note, and that was it. I'm sorry, goodbye. 26 years ago, James was in a terrible accident. The driver they were traveling with lost control and slammed full speed into a truck. The guy behind the wheel died instantly, and James suffered head injuries. He was in a coma for 3 months, and the doctors gave a very poor prognosis. Kathy was supposed to go with them, but she had an emergency. The girl miraculously escaped a terrible tragedy. James did not know about it, but Kathy did not go with him then because she had a doctor's appointment. She suspected a pregnancy, and the doctor confirmed it. How happy was she? She and James talked a lot about having kids. The guy had always dreamed of having a son. He would be very happy with this news. Kathy did not yet know that he had been in an accident. Of course, the girl had no idea that she would never see him again. Even the night before, they had had a nice conversation, and Kathy had said that she suspected pregnancy. James had promised to carry her in his arms, and if it turned out to be true. When James regained consciousness, the first thing he asked about was his beloved. It was filed away in his memory that she was traveling with him. His parents reassured him. Kathy wasn't in the car, but they had some bad news. Kathy had only come to visit her lover once. She wanted to say goodbye to him. The girl gave James's parents a letter asking them to give it to him when the young man came to his senses. So the parents did. In the letter, Kathy confessed her treason, asked to forgive her and forget about her forever. It was this story that the man told Betty, diluted it with his angry comments and curses to change it. He shared that after Kathy, he could not trust any other girl. He hated the female gender in general. Because of such a vile act, the beloved James had to spend his entire life alone. The man was overwhelmed with emotion. He had spent so many years trying to get it out of his head. These memories avoided showing his feelings. Then he just burst into tears. He spoke so emotionally that the other diners and waiters looked at him warily. James had kept it all to himself for too long and would rather forget it forever. It wasn't until a year after the accident that James was able to get back on his feet. All this time he was in and out of clinics and rehab. Asked his parents to look for Tanya, but there was no hint of her presence anywhere. When the therapy was over, James himself tried to find his beloved and get an explanation from her, but he couldn't find her either. He assumed she had skipped town, as if she had vanished. Betty listened to him, her face changing more and more. She didn't understand what the nonsense was. He says it wasn't like that. A very heartwarming story, Betty said, when James had finished spilling his guts. Only it has nothing to do with what I know. James looked at her with misunderstanding. They were talking about different situations. I don't understand you, James said. Why don't you share your point of view on this story? Betty said that as soon as Kathy found out about the accident, she immediately ran to the hospital. There, James' parents chased the girl away. She asked to be let in to see him, but they said that the guy didn't want to see his girlfriend. Allegedly, James asked to tell her that he was leaving Tanya and asked her never to disturb him again. The girl was screaming and begging to be let in. She said she was pregnant. But after that, the parents got even more furious with the unfortunate girl. Kathy didn't understand why James didn't answer her. He must have heard her screams. Kathy didn't even know that her lover was in a coma. She wanted to cheer him up with the news. What's the baby waiting? But he chased her away so indifferently. Nervous, Kathy even almost had a miscarriage. The girl fell into despair and in search of peace of mind. She went to the country. There Kathy found a simple guy, very kind and good. She married him. He took the child as his own. Although the baby was born with abnormalities, he had some health problems. Betty didn't remember exactly what they were. James listened very carefully. It was hard to believe that all this was true. So he had a child, a son, who was nowhere to be found. If he's even alive, I can find her now. Asked Mason in a voice hoarse with terror. You can, but you can't talk to her. She died a few years ago. A blood clot broke. There was no rescue, Betty replied. She was buried there in the village. Her husband died a long time ago. What about the baby? Where is he now, do you know? James's voice trembled at that question. He must have stayed there in the village. "I don't know," Betty replied. "The last time I was in that village was for a funeral. If you're interested, I could write. Don't you think? I'd be very grateful." Betty gave James the note with the address. They talked some more. James shared his emotions about what he had heard. His parents had always insinuated to him that Kathy wasn't right for him, that her social status was much lower than his. James had a lot of fights with his parents about it, but he couldn't imagine that they would stoop to doing such a terrible thing to her, or to him either. He didn't understand how they could have kept quiet for so many years. Mom had always worried that James was always alone. She dreamed of grandchildren. She knew James had a child. She ruined her son's life, and never once in her life even hinted at her mistake, never once repented. If his parents were alive, he'd ask them if they'd ever regretted what they'd done. When James returned home, he was finally able to let his feelings out. The man collapsed on the floor and cried. All his life he had lived in deceit, and the people closest to him had done this to him. How could his mother calmly watch his mental torment and remain silent? Why couldn't his father give him a hint? He hated them with all his soul, like he had hated Tonya just yesterday. Mason pounded the floor and screamed in despair. His poor cat hid under the couch. She had never seen her owner in such a state of mind before. James couldn't calm down for hours, only repeating why and for what. Charles arrived in his hometown. Everything here reminded him of his mom. The guy didn't like this place. He associated with it only boredom, sadness, and hopelessness. That's exactly how he felt here. While Charles lived in the village, nothing interesting happened to him. But his mother was there to help him, to give him advice. Now his mother was not here, and the house was completely empty. But this time Charles looked at his ancestral nest differently. It was his place of power. It carried the memories of his mother. Yes, the village had been boring, but no one had hurt him here. In this house he felt calm and confident that everything would be all right. In the city, he could not feel happy. There he was seen as different, as an inconvenient, inferior creature. Charles decided to stay in the village for a couple of weeks. He wanted to fill this cozy home atmosphere, to think about his plans and goals, to decide what he wanted to do next. But he was hesitant to go to his mother's grave. Until he saw that fence and that monument. It was like Mom was alive. It seemed to him that now the door would open and his mother would enter the house, embrace him and warm him with the warmth of her soul, support him, as it had always been before. But no one would come through the door, no one would press her to his chest and say everything would be all right. Charles felt as if he was reliving his mother's departure all over again. It was unbearably painful. The young man's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of an incoming message. It was Adriana. She was worried that Charles had stopped posting new works. She wondered if he was doing well, how much he would have liked to tell her about all the torments of his soul, to pour out all his sorrows. But Charles just read the message and left it unanswered. James took a long time to come to his senses after he learned the truth about Kathy's disappearance. All his life he had lived under a deception orchestrated by his parents. James warned his companion that he would be away from the workplace for a while. "You're going on vacation. Good for you," Jacob told him. "Not quite," James explained. He told Jacob the truth about his departure, shared the news about his son. Jacob was shocked, but happy for his comrade. He was worried that he was lonely. It is nice to realize that he still has a family member in his life. The companion convinced James that he could leave for any length of time. He will follow the company. On the way, James thought about what he would say to his son. How would he be able to explain such a long absence? Would his son forgive him? James tried to imagine how his beloved felt when she heard that he did not want to see her. It turns out she was going through the same emotions he was. But Kathy was able to find her happiness. She didn't get angry at the entire male species. So why couldn't he trust the world? Closed himself off from it. What a pity he couldn't explain himself to her. He didn't tell her the truth. How much happiness was lost. And all because of two people who just couldn't let their child marry a bride who wasn't rich. Money and connections solve everything, my father used to say. Oh, how wrong he was. If he could feel his son's heartache for even a fraction of a second, you wouldn't think so. James drove to the address and looked at the house. It's just a rustic cabin. Nothing remarkable about it. He knocked on the door, but no one answered. Surely no one is here anymore, the man said aloud to himself. What did I expect? Suddenly James heard a creaking sound. But the sound didn't come from inside the house. It came from the side. It was the neighboring door falling off. An old woman approached the man. She looked carefully at James' expensive car and then at him. Are you looking for someone? She asked. Yes, I was wondering if anyone lives in this house. Kathy used to live here with Ivan. He's been here about 15 years. How did he die? And Tanya was buried recently. What a nice family she was. It's a shame. The old lady got carried away with her memories. I see. James interrupted her. It turns out the house is empty now. The son arrived this week. He's been living here for a while. He's gone to his grave, I guess. I saw him walking toward the cemetery this morning. James's heart was racing. The grandmother had talked about his son, which meant he could still meet his child. While the old woman went back to talking about how sorry she was for the poor orphan boy, James tried to control his emotions. Can you show me where Kathy's grave is? James asked, interrupting his grandmother again. She was very close to me, and I'd like to say goodbye. The old woman was happy to oblige. She took James to the cemetery and explained the directions to Kathy's grave. She did not go herself, so as not to get in the way. The man walked on, unable to believe what was happening. It hurt him so much to realize that he would be able to see the love of his life. Now only here. So many years had passed, and his feelings were still just as strong. After he found out that Kathy didn't betray him, he nurtured warmth and tenderness towards her even more. James noticed from afar that someone was sitting on one of the graves. The old woman described it as Kathy's grave. She said her son was walking toward it. James' heart was stabbed. It turns out that's where his son is now. In just a moment he would meet him. James stopped his feet, further did not lead him. The man began to doubt that he was doing the right thing. How would he ever be able to explain to a grown boy that he was his father? And he was absent from his life because his grandparents considered his mother an unprofitable party. Taking a deep breath, James took the step forward. There was no turning back. He had already overcome so much to be here. Running away like a coward at the last moment was not his style. But the closer James got, the more he wanted to turn around and walk away. The man began to recognize the man who sat at Kathy Currier's grave as the man he had squeezed out of the workplace in such a lowly manner. Charles looked at his mother's picture and remembered the pleasant times they had shared together. How he had gone to first grade, how he had drawn his first picture. And Mom hung it on the wall. It still hangs in the hall, only in a frame. There was some kind of meadow and some animals. All of them. That a 5-year-old boy could draw. Charles asked many times to have it removed from the wall, but his mother said it was a memory. She liked to joke that when you become a famous artist, I care by selling your first painting ever. The memories of childhood were interrupted by a man walking in the distance. He didn't look like a villager. He was dressed in an overly formal suit. It felt like he was walking straight towards him. The boy tried to look away from him so he wouldn't stare so intently. But suddenly he recognized him. It was James. What was he doing in this remote village? And why was he walking through a cemetery? He's definitely coming to see me, Charles thought. A thrill of excitement mixed with incomprehension came over the boy. Maybe he was looking for him on purpose to apologize. That's too silly. Charles was not such an important man that the owner of a large firm himself would follow him around the countryside. Almost reaching the grave, James stopped suddenly. He recognized the guy who was sitting on the ground. It was the same Currier. It turns out that this is his son. Betty said that the kid had some kind of health problem. How James hadn't noticed the resemblance to this kid right away. James' hands trembled for a long time. He hadn't felt this excited in a long time. "Hello," said James in a very hoarse voice. It always gave away his excitement. "I know you want to know what I'm doing here." Charles got to his feet and stared at the approaching man intently. His eyes were gushing with rage. His posture betrayed an aggressive attitude. but he listened attentively to James. Curiosity overcame the anger in him. "I take it you don't treat me in the best way." James kept talking. "And you have good reasons for that. But please listen to me carefully and try to understand. Your mom and I knew each other years ago. We didn't just know each other, we loved each other. But life, or rather my parents, played a cruel joke on our destinies. Anyway, I'm your father." James paused. Charles's face stretched with surprise. He shook his head, refusing to believe it. Tears came to James's eyes. He put his hands out in front of him as if he were surrendering. With a little gasp of excitement, he continued talking. James said that he didn't know that his girlfriend was pregnant, told how he had been in a car accident and had been in a coma for months. That during this time his parents so cruelly deceived Tanya. The man repented, saying that he would never have become such a cruel person, if not for that situation. He asked for forgiveness. Charles could not hold back his tears either. It was hard to believe that what James was saying was true, but it wasn't as if he was deceiving. And why would he do that? James fell to his knees in front of his son. He apologized for his years of absence from his son's life, for his deception, at work, and for stealing the images. James promised to make things right. Charles walked over to James and held out his hand to help him stand up. As James rose to his feet, Charles gave him a hug. The man returned the favor, and the emotion hit him even harder. Charles could not say anything, but James felt that his son had forgiven him. Finally, these two lonely souls had found each other. Each now had a loved one in this world. James looked at the picture of Kathy. She was as beautiful as she had been in her youth. Then the man looked at his son. Charles looked very much like his mother. But why hadn't James noticed it at once? Maybe it was the boy's beard, which was too thick. But his eyes were as kind and naive as Kathy's. James could stare into them for hours. He had never noticed those eyes before. After sitting in the cemetery for a while longer and thinking, each to his own, they headed for the house. Charles showed them how they lived with their mother. James noted that their habits hadn't changed over time. She always kept the house clean. The rooms had her handwriting paintings on the walls, volumes of poetry on the shelves. Kathy had loved it all when she was young. She wrote the occasional poem herself. James asked if Charles was going back to town, but he shook his head no. He didn't want to go back to a place where no one accepted him. He felt he had no place in the city. "You're not alone now," James said and put his hand on his son's shoulder. "I won't leave you anymore. I'll always be here for you. By the way, you're very talented. The collection we made from your designs is selling great. We've never had such a sensation before." Charles smiled smugly. Everyone likes to be praised. In Charles's case, James was the second person after Mom and Adriana who recognized his talent. "I think I'll find a place for you in our company." "No more bets you'll create new designs for us?" James suggested. Charles nodded his head happily. Of course he agreed. It was his dream come true. It was a little different from the way he wanted it to be realized, but he regarded the fact that his idea had been stolen as approval. The guy started packing his things so that he could leave before dark. As they rode in the car, James talked about how happy he and his mom were. Charles loved listening to those stories. He pictured his mom young and in love. His phone wouldn't stop vibrating. A message from Adriana came every 10 minutes. The girl didn't understand why she was being ignored. Charles had disappeared so abruptly. She thought she had offended him. "Who's texting you?" "A girl." "Such a handsome man must have many admirers," James inquired. Charles shook his head modestly, but his cheeks were flushed with an angry blush. James laughed at his son and explained that there was no need to be ashamed of your illness. "Lots of people have flaws, but everyone lives with them. I, for example, am a surprisingly nasty person. And I'm okay with that," James joked. Charles nodded in agreement. He had not yet forgotten how he had been cheated out of his firm, and his work had been misappropriated. James apologized to him again. Charles' phone kept ringing. James still managed to talk his son into showing him the girl who was so eager for an answer. "That's how I know her." "Nice girl," James replied. "Why did you answer?" "Offended." Charles didn't bother to answer. He gestured that the story wasn't important. "Did you meet at some meeting of yours?" The man asked. "Do you have some sort of club for people with disabilities?" Charles looked at his father with a puzzled expression. He didn't know what he was talking about. "Why are you looking at me like that?" "I said something wrong, but I'm sorry, I haven't learned yet." Charles once again showed the photo of the girl and indicated that he wanted to know how James knew her. "This girl is an art historian, and I, like any rich person, have my quirks. I wanted something to decorate the living room. So I found this Adriana. She recommended me a beautiful painting. This girl is a professional, and when I met her, I found out she was deaf and dumb. I was so surprised. But the main thing for me is that she did her job well." He stopped abruptly because he remembered how he had wanted to get rid of Charles just because he was mute. But the boy paid no attention to James' embarrassment or to what he had said earlier. Charles' eyes lit up. He was hiding from Adriana for nothing. If she has the same affliction, then she won't turn her back on him. The guy quickly replied to the message and apologized for taking so long to respond. He also apologized for being in the village, and the connection is very bad. As soon as Adriana replied, Charles immediately asked her out. James drove Charles home and invited him to work tomorrow. He wanted to redeem himself to him as soon as possible. Now, he would not let his son go anywhere, and he would do everything he could to make sure he didn't need anything. James drove to the office to notify Jacob, but he was not there yet. James sat down at his desk. He liked to sit at his desk like this and reflect on his life. Today, he had found a family. James was no longer alone in the world. He kept trying to figure out how it was that fate had played a joke on him, bringing his son to him. He didn't even realize it. How could he have known? Kathy, by the way, also liked to draw. Good thing the son took more from his mother than his father. James had no talent to boast of. He didn't possess mental wealth either. James' gaze fell on some papers on the table. It was the kind of contract James had never seen before. He'd only been away from work for a day, and Jacob had already made some kind of deal without even consulting him. And why had he left the papers in James's office when he had his own? The man scrutinized the contract. There was a sum with many zeros. It was a contract for the supply of diamonds, but what surprised James the most was his signature. It had been forged, of course. James remembered every paper he had signed. These were definitely not the papers he signed, although the signature was very skillfully done, almost indistinguishable. The man was too distracted by the angry events. He didn't want to get into an argument. He decided to leave the matter until the next day. Charles and Adriana met at a cafe. They communicated through gestures. To Charles' surprise, Adriana already knew that the guy was not mine. But how could she have known? She immediately started asking how he was doing, and generally acted as if they already knew each other before. "Did you get home okay last time?" Adriana asked. Charles didn't understand anything. What last time? Maybe he had a doppelganger that the girl had mistaken him for. He asked her what she meant. It turned out that the day Charles was saddened by the deception and dismissal, went to pour his grief in a bar. That's where Adriana met him. He was so drunk that he didn't remember it. They laughed about the situation. "I guess we'll have to get reacquainted," Charles said, "because I don't remember anything at all." Adriana said that Charles had helped her that night. A pickpocket had tried to rob her, but Charles had stopped him and neutralized him. Then they talked for a long time, and the guy told her how he had been set up and kicked out of his job. That day, Adriana told her that she worked as an art historian and even promised Charles to do an exhibition of his work. But she realized that he had forgotten all about it because he had never hinted at it in his correspondence. "Why didn't you tell me about this before?" he asked. "I was curious to know what kind of person when sober," answered Adriana. "It was just fun. They had a great evening." Charles walked Adriana home. He shared his story that had happened to him in the village. He told her that now he had a father and he got him a job as a designer. The girl wished him good luck. They agreed to meet again. When James entered his office, Jacob was already sitting there. The man obviously did not expect to see his comrade. He looked startled by him when he opened the door You're back already? I thought you'd be gone for at least a week, James said. That's why you decided to pull some schemes behind my back. James asked in an unfriendly tone. What kind of schemes? If you're talking about the diamonds, they're clean. It just needed to be done right away. That's why I signed your signature, Jacob explained. But we've never worked with this company before. I want to check everything out, said James. Jacob was clearly nervous. James suspected something. After checking, he made sure everything was done well, there were no problems. The few diamonds he checked were real in the papers. No problems or errors he found. Why then was Jacob acting so suspicious? While James was thinking to himself about his companion's strange behavior, Charles walked in. James greeted his son with a hug, sat him down beside him, and explained the nature of the work. Charles came in with some ideas. James was very pleased with his son. He alone could replace all their designers. While father and son were discussing work issues, Charles texted Adriana and said that they needed to talk urgently. She asked James to come to the meeting. The man was surprised, but did not refuse. In an hour, they were already sitting in the cafe waiting for Adriana. The girl came running, very anxious, and it was obvious that she was in a hurry. She brought a notebook with her, which she handed to James, since he did not understand sign language. Adriana wrote that Jacob and another young man wanted to frame James. A deal that had been so carefully scrutinized. James was being set up. Yes, he checked a few diamonds, but those are the only ones that are real. The rest of the stones are just plain glass. How did you know that? James asked. He's used to the fact that in business you can't trust anyone, even if it's your son's girlfriend. Adriana explained that Jacob had come to the gallery today. She remembered him. She saw him in the office when she was consulting on paintings for James. He and a young man were discussing their plan. They knew no one would hear them in the art gallery. There were no visitors, and the only employee was a deaf-mute girl. But they didn't know she could read lips. So an inspection is due tomorrow, and they're going to find the fake stones. James is gonna set it up, and Jacob's gonna take over that guy's company. He wants to make him his assistant. And I knew right away there was something wrong with that contract, James said. Thank you, Adriana. You literally saved me. James quickly went back to the office and destroyed all the contracts on the deal with his signature on them. When the audit came back, there was nothing on him. Jacob, on the other hand, quickly quit his job and fled the country when he realized his deception had been exposed. Mason himself left the company before James could get to him. If it wasn't for your girlfriend, our lives would have been ruined, James told Charles. The guy was very proud of his girlfriend and was grateful to her. Charles was now the second person in James's firm. They developed a real family business. The guy successfully created new collections. Adriana, as promised, organized an exhibition of his paintings. Soon everyone in town knew about the artist. And Charles even had fans who bought his paintings at auctions at crazy prices. One day James was driving home after another day of work. He and Charles had been doing a great job. But now James was the sole manager of the company. He didn't have enough time to deal with everything. Charles helped, but he could not replace Jacob and Mason. The man reflected that he had never paid attention to this Mason before. It seemed that he didn't seem to decide anything important. In fact, it was difficult without him. It was necessary to look for new partners. Otherwise, James wouldn't have any free time at all. And now he has a family. He had to make time for them. James' problem was that he was quickly becoming disillusioned with people. After Kathy betrayed him, he stopped trusting any woman in the world. And after being set up by his best friend, he couldn't trust his partners either. How was he going to find a partner if he was always expecting to be deceived? In such thoughts, he didn't notice how he passed his turn and drove far away from home. Now it is necessary to look for a place to turn around. The man scolded himself. I've been so remorseful lately. James looked around carefully to make the right turn. Suddenly, he noticed a man lying on the sidewalk. He quickly stopped and got out of the car. As he approached the man lying there, he saw that the guy was beaten up. There wasn't a living spot on his body. You need help. Can you hear me? James asked the victim. The guy turned from his stomach to his back. and the man recognized his old acquaintance. "Mason, who are you so frightened?" asked James. He immediately called an ambulance. "Forgive me, James. Why did you ask?" "Mason, stop it. Help is coming, then we'll talk," James replied. The doctors arrived and took Mason to the hospital. James did not understand why he decided to help this traitor. Just a few days ago, he would have gladly done the same thing to him. But after meeting Charles, or rather, after learning that he was his son, James became much kinder. He began to notice it himself. Before, only his favorite cat could know his soft character. Now, even the employees began to smile more broadly and sincerely at him. James decided that the situation that had happened with Mason was the perfect excuse to find out why he and Jacob had decided to set him up. 2 days later, he approached the former assistant at the hospital and even bought him some goodies. "Well, hello," greeted James. "Tell me, who attacked you?" "The official version is robbery," answered Mason. "But I think it's all nonsense. Most likely, these scoundrels were sent. Jacob, because they stole my phone, but did not touch my wallet with money. In fact, I think their goal was to maim me, not rob me." "What makes you think it was Jacob?" James wondered. "You were in cahoots with him." Mason said that initially did not want to participate in the scam. But Jacob said that Mason either with him or he will throw him out of the firm or set him up and put him in jail for years. The guy is scared because he has a sick mother at home and no one to take care of her but him. And she needs expensive treatment. That's why he couldn't be fired either. Jacob promised him a nice profit for the setup, enough money for the surgery to save Mom's life. So Mason agreed, even though he regretted that decision many times. When it was all over, Jacob ran away, but feared that Mason might rat him out to the police or James. So he started intimidating the guy, and then this attack. If it hadn't been for an old lady passing by who scared the intruders away, there's no telling how it would have ended. James listened carefully to Mason. He thanked him for his honesty, wished him a speedy recovery, and wanted to leave. Lastly, Mason confessed that Jacob had a grudge against James for a long time. He wanted to keep the invalid to somehow ruin James' status through him and take his place. Then Mason apologized a few more times, saying he'd only done it for his mom. James walked out of the hospital as if twisted and outward. He didn't understand why Jacob was so angry with him. He was not a poor man to be so jealous of his comrade's financial situation. Jacob had no less money than James had. What was the reason for this dislike? James had been friends with Jacob since the days of the Institute. His friend supported him when Kathy left him for someone else, even tried to find him a girlfriend. What had clicked in the man's head that he changed his opinion of his comrade so drastically? Fortunately, James now had someone to talk to. There was no need to keep all his worries to himself. James shared his problem and his thoughts with Charles. His son told him that he guessed. What is the reason for Jacob's attitude towards James? When Charles was little, he had heard that his mom often fought with his stepfather because he was jealous of some guy, whose name was also Jacob. This guy wrote her letters, even came to her village a few times. He confessed his love, said he'd always known James was no match for her, begged her to be with him. Maybe this is Jacob. James felt like he'd been electrocuted. Was it all out of jealousy? Jacob had known all his life where Kathy lived, that she had a child, and that she had never left him. James could forgive a setup at work, but he couldn't forget something like that. He'd probably guessed about Charles the first time he'd come into his office. Charles shrugged. It could have been that too. After all, Jacob knew that Kathy had a son who wasn't mine. He also added that he felt sorry for Mason. He advised his father to think about him again. After all, the man has a sick mom. James was already thinking about it himself. He didn't think Mason would have had the brains and courage to do such a wicked thing against his boss. When Mason was released from the hospital, James invited him to the office for a talk. Mason came gladly. The bruises were still on his face. He didn't look good. "I'm willing to give you a second chance," said Mason James, "but I need assurances that you won't plot against me again." "Of course not," Mason replied in a guilty voice. "I've always respected you." James believed him. In fact, He'd helped him with his mom's surgery. He decided to make amends to his employees. He gave them raises, gave some of them vacation time. The company started to thrive. Mason quickly got up to speed. He was very grateful for the help with his mother's treatment, so he couldn't even think ill of James. A few months later, Charles took an important step. He proposed marriage to Adriana. The ring for the bride he created himself. His father gave the young couple a large apartment in the center of the city near his home, so that they were always looked after. James and Charles never parted again. One day, Charles decided to find out how his father could find Kathy's house and how he knew that he had a child. James said that it all happened by accident. If it hadn't been for his mom's friend, James would never have met his son. And then it dawned on him that he should thank her for her help. After all, she had helped bring the family together. James found the piece of paper on which Betty had written Kathy's address. He hoped there were some of her contacts, but it was just a piece of notepaper. James didn't have the woman's phone number either. But he didn't give up trying to track her down. The man decided to drive to the house where Betty used to live. Maybe her mother was still alive and could tell him where to find her daughter. Maybe she still lived there. James headed for a neighborhood he hadn't visited in years. It remained forever in association with Kathy, so the man avoided it on principle. And there was nothing for a businessman to do on the outskirts of the city in a bedroom neighborhood. Approaching a familiar house, James realized from afar that Betty would not be found here. In place of the old 5-story building where the girl had once lived, a shopping mall was rising. But James drove to it anyway. He sat in the car, immersed in memories. 20-odd years ago, he had been very happy in this place. His first and only love had happened here. Now there were no benches where he and Kathy had sat, no squares where they had walked, no houses where anyone's life had been lived. Well, I must go before I repent, James said to himself. But suddenly he noticed a familiar symbol on one of the signs. It was an advertisement for a beauty parlor. But what caught his eye was an unusual flower, the kind Kathy had drawn everywhere she could draw. He would never mistake those petals for anything. He had seen them 1,000 times. Kathy considered this drawing her talisman. She drew it on all her notebooks, on her hands, even on her clothes. James couldn't ignore that fact. He decided to figure out what this salon was all about. James followed the sign and stopped at the Beauty Kingdom. He was greeted by a young woman receptionist. She looked at him very strangely, but greeted him politely and courteously. "Would you like a treatment?" With doubt in her voice, asked the girl behind the counter. "And I'd like to know about the symbol James said on your sign." "What does it mean?" "It's just a flower." "It was designed by the owner of the salon," said the girl, looking at James even more strangely. James decided to find out what the salon owner's name was. His guess was correct. She was Betty. He started to ask for her number, but the girl said she had no right to give out such information, and even refused to give him any money. "Betty will come at the end of the shift. She always comes on Mondays to have a meeting with the foreman," the girl replied. When her patience began to run out, "If you need her so much, can you wait for her here? The shift will be over in 2 o'clock." The girl hoped that the strange man would leave, but he settled down on the sofa for customers. James decided to wait for Betty. This might be his only chance to see her. The receptionist texted her boss telling her that she was expected at the salon. She was afraid it might be the checker. Betty arrived an hour later. The woman was very surprised to see an old acquaintance, but this time she was glad to see him. She asked James if he had succeeded in finding Kathy's grave, and he told about all his adventures that had happened to him after that trip. He thanked her for her help for a long time. If it wasn't for this woman, James would never have teamed up with his son. "I'm truly happy for you," Betty said. "Tell me about the sign on your sign," James asked. Betty confirmed that it was the symbol that Kathy loved so much. Betty had decided to memorialize their friendship. She had come up with it before her friend died. She said it really did bring happiness. By the way, Betty suddenly remembered. "Do you remember Jacob? You were friends with him at the Institute." James remembered Jacob very well and wished he could forget about him forever. But he wondered why Betty would suddenly talk about him. It turned out that she had read the news that the Russian businessman Jacob Wick had wrecked his yacht and sunk somewhere in Indonesia. You have a very strange reaction to the news of an old friend's death, Betty said, when she noticed that James had a strange smile on his face. Then the man told her what Jacob was really like. Not only did he want to put James in jail, he had also kept the truth from him for so many years. Betty was shocked after such a heartfelt conversation. They had bonded. Betty even forgot about her inspection that she did every Monday and let the girls go home, for which the girls were very grateful. Suddenly, the reward to the supreme guest. Betty and James talked for several more hours. Betty told about her life story, which was also quite sad. She was also lonely, just like James. After this intimate conversation, they met a few more times. Then they went out to lunch and then to dinner. Eventually, the old friends recognized that they could no longer live without each other. An affair began between them. Charles accepted his father's new woman well. He was glad that he had finally stopped spending his evenings in the company of Kat.